Uh, Good afternoon. It's fun to be here in the room. It's part of looking to the future with a greater degree of confidence than we've had before. Obviously, pride goeth before a fall, so I take all of that back. But it's still great to be here, and also great to welcome all of you who are joining us somewhere else in the world, whether it's upstairs in your office or across the ocean. And we're here to listen to Ariel Fein talk to us about wood as used by the Fatimids. Ariel is a Field of the Future Fellow at the Bard Graduate Center this semester. She comes to us with a PhD in the History of Art Department from Yale, just awarded last academic year. Before that, she had done an MA at Yale and at the Courtauld Institute in London. At the Courtauld, she worked on metalwork, so she's moved earlier in time into a slightly different material. While finishing her dissertation, she was a Jane and Morgan Whitney Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the Islamic Art Department. She won the Francis Blanchard Dissertation Prize at Yale for her dissertation, and at the Courtauld won the Director's Prize for her MA dissertation. She's presented at conferences on Kufic epigraphy across southern Italy, Sicily, and Africa, and on Fatimid-style wood carving in Palermo, Sicily. And in terms of publication, she's published on the visual culture of Norman Sicily, on the Capella Palatina, and on post-Byzantine and Ottoman afterlives of the Pamakaristos, the Fethia Jami in Istanbul. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her here. For those of you watching, please feel free to send in questions to the Q&A, and we will monitor them and happily ask your questions for you at the end. Ariel, please.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and a special thank you to the Bard Graduate Center for supporting me and supporting my research this semester as a Fields of the Future Fellow. According to the 10th century philosopher of Khorasan, Abu Yaqub Sijistani, there are various types of wood in the world, but unless a craftsman molds it into a specific shape, the wood is worthless. He argues that, quote, the wood's worth and benefit become manifest only after it receives the craftsman's craftsmanship, end quote. Although Sijistani is speaking metaphorically here, he's speaking about wood as a means to describe the revelation of Islamic law and its interpretation. It's an especially fitting description of the Fatimid woodcarver's craft, transforming raw material into an exquisite masterpiece. In the 10th through 12th centuries under the Fatimids, the woodcarving craft reached new heights with delicately carved figural scenes, intricate foliant motifs, geometric patterns adorning the interiors of their mosques, synagogues, palaces, and churches. I'm showing you here some of the best preserved materials, which can be directly tied to the decoration of the Fatimid Western Palace in Cairo. Although the palace itself was destroyed, the wood survived through its reuse in the hospital of Mamluk Sultan Qalawun in the late 13th century, where some fragments, including these ceiling beams, can still be found today. In addition to other works that are still in situ in Egypt, much of the remains of this vibrant tradition are now dispersed across museum collections internationally. Now, while woodcarving was one of the primary decorative media that was employed by the Fatimids, these works remain enigmatic. Save a handful of carvings that are still in situ, the majority have been removed from their original settings without any clear documentation. Likewise, the extant documents and epigraphic evidence provide limited help in securing their provenance, their dating, even their function. In the absence of sources, previous scholarship has primarily analyzed these works through a comparative stylistic approach and attempted to define their chronology. But these materials demand new questions. Given the relative scarcity of wood as a raw material in Egypt, where did the materials come from? How were the carvings constructed, and what does this tell us about workshop practices and the relationship of wood carving to crafts in other media? And given the wide geographic expanse of the Fatimid Empire, from its origins in Ifriqiya, modern-day Tunisia and Algeria, to its cross-cultural context across the Mediterranean, how can we define and map the networks of wood carving across Fatimid territories? So today, in the first half of this talk, I'm going to share with you a case study that's going to examine the presence of so-called Fatimid-style wood carving outside of Egypt on the island of Sicily. And this case study explores one example of the potential diffusion of Fatimid techniques, craftsmen, and styles beyond Fatimid borders. In the second half of this talk, I'm going to turn to a more expansive project that I'm working on now of mapping Fatimid wood networks and some of the new directions and questions concerning materials and manufacture that have arisen so far. So let's go beyond Cairo. Let's look at Norman Sicily. In the 10th century, the Fatimid dynasty established itself in Ifriqiya, modern-day Tunisia and Algeria, where it steadily grew as a dominant force in the Mediterranean. In 973, Caliph Al-Mu'iz moved to Egypt, thereby shifting the capital of the empire to Cairo. But Fatimid territories and interests remained in the central Mediterranean, the Western Mediterranean, and in Ifriqiya, Sicily, and other territories of the Maghreb. Now, this history is not unexplored, but in the fields of material and visual culture, the overwhelming scholarly emphasis is placed on Cairo, and it's overshadowed alternate centers of production across the vast Fatimid Empire, as well as Fatimid contacts throughout the Mediterranean and Maghreb. This is especially the case when we look at Norman Sicily, where the study of its Arab facet is focused primarily on a Palermo-Cairo axis. By looking at this group of Fatimid-style wood carvings, this talk raises questions about the nature of contact between Norman Sicily, Egypt, and Ifriqiya. In addition to looking at these works through traditional modes of historical context and formal analysis, I'm also going to look at technologies of manufacture and decoration based on firsthand study of the materials. And these bring to light new ideas about construction techniques within and beyond the medieval Mediterranean. So here we're looking at a map of the Mediterranean basin, and at the center of the Mediterranean Sea, we see Sicily, which acted as a critical juncture, a meeting point between cultures and continents. To the north, we have the small island is separated by only 2.5 miles, separated from mainland Italy and a gateway to Christian Europe. To its south, only 90 miles wide, is this Strait of Sicily, which joins Sicily to Ifriqiya and the Muslim territories of North Africa and the Maghreb. The waters of the Mediterranean Sea also connected the island to the more distant shores of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, to the Byzantine Empire as well. While Sicily's connectivity has always shifted throughout the centuries, its strategic position at the center of the Mediterranean attracted waves of settlers, waves of conquerors, and positioned its population in economic, diplomatic, and cultural contact with various regions. In terms of its history, following centuries of Byzantine rule, in the 9th century, the Aghlabid emirs of Ifriqiya gradually conquered the island, heralding nearly 2.5 centuries of Muslim rule on the island. With the foundation of the Fatimid Caliphate in the 10th century, Sicily became an outpost of the Fatimid Empire. It was governed by emirs belonging to the Caliphate family, who transformed Sicily and its capital of Palermo into a thriving urban center. The Caliphates maintained close contacts with nearby Ifriqiya and established new economic ties with the more distant Fatimid Egyptian shores. By the late 11th century, however, the island was politically fractured, and this left an opportunity for the Normans to descend through southern Italy and onto Sicily and seize control of the island. These new Norman conquerors, they introduced Latin traditions and Latin Christian institutions, while also retaining some of the existing Greek and Islamic linguistic, administrative, and fiscal structures. The Norman kingdom of Sicily, established in 1130, has since been described as a poster child of multiculturalism. With its religiously heterogeneous population, its combination of Islamicizing, Byzantinizing, and Romanesque art and architecture, it certainly seems to fit that title. Perhaps here I'm showing you perhaps the most emblematic example of that diverse environment, King Roger II's Capella Palatina. It's in this same environment in Palermo that we find 8 carved wooden elements that date to the 12th century. Based on written reports and photographic evidence, they can be reconstructed as belonging to 3 separate monuments. The first are these belonging to the Martorana Church, which was built by George of Antioch, the Grand Vizier to Norman King Roger II. And they belonged either in his church or his adjacent residence. And you can see that the doors are composed of these individual panels, as well as 5 panels here arranged in a door soffit. The second group come from the residence of Adelicia di Golisano, adjacent, just behind the Martorana Church. Unfortunately, the courtyard itself was destroyed during World War II, but the doors were originally installed here. And we can reconstruct their appearance through the surviving fragments, as well as a 19th century text and engravings. Here we see the door soffit belonging to the Golisano residence, as well as the original parts of the original framework, elements of the door jambs, including here this central piece and this outer facing panel here, and these inner pieces as well. Finally, there is one additional door soffit, which can be found today in the Palazzo dei Normanni, the seat of the King of Sicily and the site of course, the famous Cappella Palatina, which is now home to the Sicilian Regional Assembly. Unfortunately, there's just no documentation for us to determine precisely where it originally was found. So what is this Fatimid connection? The limited studies of this group of Sicilian wood carvings almost unanimously describe them as pretty much fully interchangeable with their Egyptian counterparts. And if we take a cursory look at some of these coeval Fatimid wood carvings, it seems to confirm this. Here I'm showing you images from the sanctuary doors from the Coptic monasteries of Wadi Natrun, and you can see that they adopt an aniconic approach and they have a similar arrangement of panels. Here is a set of doors from the Fatimid Western Palace. Again, we see similar compositions as well as similar ornamentation. In fact, these similarities are so remarkable that some scholars have even suggested that the Sicilian corpus was produced in Egypt by Fatimid craftsmen themselves. Now, when we consider the history of the island, this argument would make sense. Following centuries of Islamic rule, Sicily was in close economic and political contact with its Muslim neighbors. And we know that Norman King Roger II dispatched his Grand Vizier, George of Antioch, to Egypt as an ambassador, who then facilitated the import of the Fatimid Diwan, or the chancery system, to Norman Sicily. Throughout this close period of contact, George has always been seen as a central figure in shaping the transmission of materials, techniques, and possibly craftsmen from the broader Mediterranean region to Sicily. So it comes as no surprise then that we find these fascinating carved wooden panels that look like Fatimid wood carvings within his church or house. But if we take a closer look at the Norman Sicilian materials, how do they really compare with their Fatimid counterparts? Where were the materials sourced? Where were the works produced, and by whom? So in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the door from Adelicia di Golisano's Palermo residence. And I'm going to look at its carving and construction in comparison with Fatimid examples. Now, looking at the decoration of the inner face of the jambs, shown here on the left, the jambs find their closest parallels in a group of late Fatimid objects that date to the mid-12th century. And these works are characterized by an experimentation with geometric forms and a combination of foliate and geometric ornament that corresponds to approaches that are more commonly seen in contemporaneous Syrian wood carving, which has led some scholars to suggest that these Fatimid works were produced during a period of increased contact with Syria and Syrian artisans. And it's precisely this contact that I think we might be seeing in these Golisano jambs. Over the next several slides, I'm going to be showing you this detail here on the right of the Golisano door jambs compared with Fatimid materials. Here we see the alternation of rhomboid and stellate forms. They're enclosed by a pearled border, and these geometric shapes enclose scrolling vines. And we see similar compositions and vertical and patterns in these vertical borders here of the Kus Minbar, which you can see a bit more clearly here in this engraving by Priesteven. We also see a similar approach, these pearled borders enclosing this foliate motifs and these geometric shapes on the interior surface of the Sayyida Nafisa mihrab niche. Now, the Golisano doors adopt an illusionistic representation of interlocking forms, of interlocking panel construction. If you look here at the Sayyida Nafisa mihrab, we're looking at a detail of the frame. You can see that the border is actually composed of hundreds of little fragments that are pieced together in an interlocking composition using tongue and groove joins. The Golisano jams, in contrast, are produced out of one solid piece of wood, but they appear to suggest the same kind of construction, where we see these triangles surrounded by deep grooves to give an impression of interlocking forms. We see a similar imitation of this interlocking construction here in the doors of the Salih Talayin Mosque, where again, it's composed out of a solid piece of wood, but these flat strapwork bands that are surrounding these ornamental features give an impression again of this interlocking construction. Now, while we do see these carved similarities between the Golisano jams and this group of late Fatimid carvings, they're not from the same group of production. The works that date to this late Fatimid group are identified by distinctive decorative elements such as the cornucopia or five-lobed palmettes, and none of these actually appear in the Sicilian corpus. So if we turn to their carving, we can get some more details. Once again, when we look, their construction. When we look at their construction, we see again, significant parallels between the Golisano doors and contemporaneous Fatimid woodwork. Here I'm showing you the Golisano door soffit on the bottom, which closely follows the arrangement of the door soffit of the 12th century convent of Deir al-Banat. This was likely originally a residence. It's later been transformed into a Coptic convent. But you can see here these three panels. We have the exact same construction of the soffit. And what we can't see in this photo is that it actually has these same quarter circle recesses, which would have allowed for the doors to turn. When we look at the exterior framework of the doors, we also see that they have carvings on the outer face of the jambs, as well as the inner face. Here I am showing you a detail of this ascending scrolling palmette frieze, which adorns the entire inner face of the Deir al-Banat jambs. Many ways here it is mirroring the construction with decoration on both sides of the Golisano jambs. However, despite these consistencies in their carving and their construction, the Golisano door frames radically depart in one element, and that is their use of nails. As you can see here, the Golisano jambs employed two different sets of nails. We have here this smaller nails, which are inserted along the border of the central frieze, as well as these larger bosses that have a decorative tracery, openwork tracery that resembles a floral motif. And in addition to securing the composite elements of the jambs together, they also have a decorative effect. Not only the metalwork tracery, but also when it was all put together, you would have had this alternation between small and large nails that had a rhythmic effect. Now, the Golisano doors are not the only doors to feature this kind of nail in Norman Sicily. We see them also in the Cappella Palatina. Here, there are two such doors like this, where we have, again, the same metalwork tracery around these metal bosses, as well as a complementary door knocker, which includes an Arabic inscription. Nails are almost entirely absent from Fatimid wood carving. The doors are composed of mortise and tenon joints, which are secured with small wooden pegs that are meant that there's really no use for nails. And in fact, if we look at the way these doors are put together, the craftsmen have really made every effort to highlight the mastery of the material itself. So there's no need for any extra decorative effect that metalwork might have added. There are only two extant doors from Fatimid Egypt which do incorporate metalwork in their construction. Here I'm showing you the doors of Bab Zuela, as well as, once again, we're looking at the doors of the Salih Talai Mosque, and you can see the alternation here of these rhomboid and circular patterns. While metalwork was almost entirely absent from Fatimid wood carving, contemporary Syrian wood carving more frequently incorporated nails, particularly for decorative effect, which you can see here in these doors from the Bimaristan Nur al-Din, a historic hospital and school in Damascus. But if we're trying to understand the use of metalwork in the doors in Sicily, I think we need to look closer to home. The preference for nails for a decorative effect can be seen in this 10th and 11th century door of the Sidi Ukba Mosque from Zirid Ifriqiya in modern-day Algeria. Just like the Golisano doors and the Cappella Paladina doors, the Sidi Ukba door makes use of similar bronze nails. And here I will show you a detail. I apologize, it's a bit blurry, but a detail of similar nails that have that same openwork tracery with a floral motif. In the Sidi Ukba door, again, they are likewise used for both a functional and decorative effect. If we then take a look at some of the wood carving from medieval Ifriqiya, we also find elements from a shared visual language. Here I am showing you a detail of the doors of the antechamber to the Maqsura of the Great Mosque of Kairouan, and it dates to the 2nd quarter of the 11th century. Not only do we see strong similarities in the vegetal scrolls, but also a similar impression of interlocking forms carved in a single piece of wood, where the Kairouan panel takes a more geometric approach. So why are we seeing these similarities? Well, again, in the 8th through 11th centuries, both Sicily and Ifriqiya were under Fatimid suzerainty, with the Kalbids ruling over Sicily and the Zirids ruling over Ifriqiya, both on behalf of the Fatimids. The regions were closely linked economically, politically, and culturally. It's possible that what we're seeing is a remnant of that contact that continued into the Norman period. Now, unfortunately, there are no pre-Norman wood carvings that survive from Sicily to support this claim, but there are documented continuities that are emerging in recent scholarship on Norman Sicily, particularly in the areas of Kufic epigraphy and textiles, continuities that bridge the pre-Norman and Norman periods. So, and these may suggest similar continuities may have persisted in the arts of metalwork and wood carving traditions as well. What about technical analysis? A technical investigation of the Sicilian wood carvings was unfortunately delayed due to COVID-19. Hopefully it will be resumed, but a 2007 study was carried out by a team from the University of Tuscia, and they studied the wood employed in the ceiling of the Cappella Palatina in its mucerna ceiling. And it has some relevance here. The study revealed that the wood belongs to the Aves species, a wood species that is found primarily in the Mount Etna region of Sicily. And this seems to confirm the historical data, which suggests that the majority of the wood that was coming into the Palermo shipyards was coming from Mount Etna, as well as a handful of other regions in Sicily, including Nicosia, Carogna, and Cefalù. So based on the scientific data from the contemporaneous mucerna ceiling and the historical evidence, it seems most likely that the woods that are being employed for the construction of the Golisano doors, as well as that broader corpus of Palermidan wood carving, came from sources within Sicily itself. So when we look across all of this data at the technology of manufacture and the decoration, it reveals that the Golisano doors do in fact share much with the contemporaneous trends in Fatimid Egypt in the mid-12th century. However, they diverge in some critical aspects of carving and construction. The Palermidan carvings may likewise be informed by centuries-long contacts with nearby Ifriqiya, which fostered wood carving and metalwork traditions on the island of Sicily that can be traced back prior to Norman rule. Rather than Fatimid-style wood carving, the Norman Sicilian wood carvers integrated these diverse visual local and foreign techniques into a uniquely Norman Sicilian product. So by focusing on this case study in Norman Sicily, I hope that you can see the value of such a close material investigation, one that's rooted in close analysis of carving and manufacture, as well as wood species identification. And this brings me to the broader question of Fatimid wood networks. As a fellow here at the Bard Graduate Center, I'm working on a project to map the networks of the circulation of wood, both the raw and carved materials, as well as technologies within the Fatimid Empire and its zones of contact in the central and western Mediterranean. I'm currently in the early stages of this project, and I want to share with you a few of the new directions and outcomes of this research so far. Building on the Norman Sicily case study, this project takes an expansive definition of Fatimid wood networks, rather than limited to wood carving produced and directly associated with Cairo or Fustat, just outside of Cairo. It looks more broadly at the spheres of sovereignty that the Fatimids promoted across the Mediterranean. I'm showing you here a map of the Fatimid Empire around the year 1000. Now, keep in mind that this project is looking at the end of the 10th century through the 12th century, and so the Fatimid Empire will be much smaller by the end of this period. But this map highlights the key regions that are involved in the production and consumption of Fatimid or Fatimid style wood carving. As you can see, in Egypt, the products of Cairo are seen alongside the wood carving of Wadi Natrun, where we find several Syriac and Coptic monasteries, as well as the Sinai Peninsula. In addition to the complex web of interactions that we've already seen linking Egypt with Fatimid and later Palermo and Ifriqiya, Ifriqiya is also given attention in its own right. I'm showing you here several of the extant Fatimid period wood carvings that are still in situ at the Monastery of St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai, including a kursi, which was used as a stand upon which you would rest a volume of the Quran, perhaps resting on a cushion, as well as the 12th century minbar, and here the 12th century doors to the fortress. Although these works share parallels with wood carving executed in Cairo, here on the left, we're looking at a sanctuary screen from a Coptic church in Fustat. The wood species identification reveals that the doors are themselves made of Mediterranean cypress, available in high mountain ridges with humid habits and cold winter temperatures. That's precisely the environment that we find in the Sinai Mountains, just around the monastery of St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai. Given the abundance of Fatimid wood carving that is still located on site, as well as the documented production of wooden icons in the monastery, it's possible that we are looking at the products of a local Sinai workshop. Along with these carvings, the monasteries of Wadi Natrun, with Fatimid Egypt alone, we are already looking at a remarkably diverse collection of materials rather than a homogeneous group of wood carvings. Expanding even further, we see networks of exchange connecting wood production in Sinai with Cyprus. On the left, I am showing you a door from the monastery of St. John Chrysostom in Koutsouvendes, Cyprus, founded in 1090 by a certain monk George, an Arab Christian from Antioch. Having fled Syria following Seljuk incursions, he briefly sojourned in Jerusalem before he ultimately settled in Cyprus, where he established his monastery. Now, the Koutsouvendes doors significantly depart from the carved wooden doors that we find on the island of Cyprus at this time, and they find much closer parallels with contemporary carvings in the Sinai region. Beyond the interactions that we already saw across Sicily, here I am showing you material that is located in Ifriqiya. If we look at the Ifriqiyan material on its own, this is just a brief sampling of the extensive wood carving preserved in Kairouan and Raqqada. And here, although they are independent of the developments of Fatimid Egypt, the Fatimid connection should not be ignored. The relations that existed between Cairo and Ifriqiya after the dynasty had moved on and settled on the Nile, it's still not clear. We really need to consider how, if at all, Egyptian fashions impacted the sophisticated decorative language that was used by the Zirids here in Ifriqiya, and conversely, how, if at all, were Maghribi fashions and practices promoted in Egypt. So in order to dig deeper into these questions, I am amassing a database of wood carving with an emphasis on materials, including wood species identification and manufacture, areas that have until now been largely overlooked in favor of questions of style. In terms of manufacture, so far the database has highlighted two key areas. The first is the extensive use of polychromy. Although the exterior buildings maintained a uniform appearance without the application of color, interior decoration was extensively painted with bright colors. And I'm showing you here a reconstruction of what those painted surfaces might have originally looked like. The second notable aspect is the use of overlay. I'm showing you here a fragment of a wooden frieze originally from the Fatimid Western Palace, and we were just looking at a more characteristic example on the prior slide. This group of carvings is typically adorned with floriated scroll backgrounds, interlaced lobe polygons, and then figural scenes. But here, you'll notice that these look unfinished. If we look here, we're just seeing the silhouettes of these figures. They're missing the details of their ornamentation. Why is that? Well, we also notice that there are holes where something was affixed. We also see here in this plain border, again, pierced holes that appear at similar intervals, suggesting once again that there was something affixed atop this wooden panel. What was that material? Well, there are several carvings that still have attached overlay. Up here on the top image, this carving of gazelles, we see here this palmette medallion, and you can actually see here a tiny peg that is affixing the medallion to the surface. So we see that wood was one of the primary materials of overlay, perhaps producing a sculptural effect that was more distinct from the typical approach to carving. These tiny miniature carvings were also likely used as overlay, but we also must consider other materials such as ivory, bone, and perhaps metalwork. And this provides substantial evidence for work and collaboration across media. Finally, when available, I am documenting the wood species of the fragments. So currently we have an incomplete picture of the selection and distribution of wood species from the Fatimid Empire. Unlike the wooden objects of Pharaonic Egypt, which are much better documented and there's much better, far more scientific analysis, the analysis of Fatimid wood carving and in fact, later Islamic wood carving as well remains limited. Wood species identification is done microscopically, and although current approaches are reliable, it is not non-invasive. It requires the removal of about a 1 centimeter cube sample from the object. So in many cases, it's just not justifiable to conduct such an analysis. That being said, several museum collections have conducted wood species identification. Many of these examinations are isolated or unpublished, or very outdated from the 60s and 70s when the technology was just not the same. Setting all of these caveats aside, so far the data accumulated challenges some of the accepted notions about the sources for wooden luxury furnishings in Fatimid Egypt. According to the documentary sources, wood was a rare and carefully controlled local resource, primarily reserved for construction and shipbuilding. The frequent reuse of wooden materials from the Pharaonic period, as well as from earlier Islamic periods, confirms this situation. To supplement the locally available woods, medieval sources indicate that Egypt imported woods from across the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. Ibn Halkal notes the import of pine from northern Syria. A late 10th century order by Byzantine Emperor John Tzimiskes to the Doge of Venice to cease the trade of wood to the Fatimids, as well as Arabic documents in the archives of Genoa, confirm the import of wood to Egypt from Italian cities. Finally, wood transported by Yemenite carpenters and sailors to Egypt from India is documented in Yemenite sources. This, along with some of the early publications of wood species analysis of Fatimid wood carvings, paints a picture of a substantial reliance on imported woods for luxury goods. However, currently, based on the data that I have been able to amass, it seems to suggest an equal reliance on local and imported woods for the manufacture of decorative furnishings. This means that we need to pay much closer attention, not only to the selection of specific species, foreign species, but also the diverse motivations for the selection of foreign versus imported woods. Now, while there is still much more data to amass, this focus on materials and manufacture promises to yield new directions in mapping Fatimid wood networks across the central and western Mediterranean. Thank you.
Two questions. One, immediate, because it's on the screen. This is the door of the Kairouan Mosque, yes?
It's the antechamber to the Maqsora, yes.
So my question was, you had drawn a distinction between polychromy on the exterior and, plain unpainted wood on the exterior, and I was just wondering where that falls because I see polychromy here. So is it an interior door?
This is an interior door. The Maqsora is a special, an isolated space within the mosque, reserved often for the king or the caliph. and it also often housed the library. So it is an interior space, but it also almost functions as an exterior structure.
Are we truly sure that there wasn't an outside, or has it just worn so badly that it can't now be removed?
That it is worn so badly. When we look at the Mamluk material, when you look not just at wood carving, but also decoration in stone, it is primarily uniform without color, which seems to suggest that the wood carving might have had a similar approach. No.
Second question was well, in a sense, how what you're detecting is networks of stylistic affiliation map onto networks of raw material distribution, and that strikes me as something that is a really vibrant field in antique, in Greco-Roman sculpture. And I'm wondering, where there's quite a controversy over, did carvers who come from Aphrodisias, is the reason they were employed that the patron wanted an Aphrodisian stone, and that there's a very, very definite sense, right, that carvers from this area know the properties of this material and are really the best people to exploit it. But it's not clear because we don't have the records. So I'm just wondering, are you suggesting that there are such distinctive differences in the materials that carvers would specialize? I mean, that, in other words, what is the relationship that you're visualizing, and how much does it depend on a hypothesis that the materials are different enough that that they'll tell us something about where the carvers themselves came from?
In terms of Sicily, I don't think it has to do necessarily with the materials being different enough. Certainly, Norman Sicilian art is bringing together so many different motifs. When we look at the mosaics of the Cappella Palatina, you're looking at a craft that looks like Byzantine mosaics, but studies have shown that it's being made in part by Byzantine mosaics, but also probably local craftsmen. And I guess what I'm looking at really here is trying to look at what is really local. There doesn't necessarily need to be a difference between the materials having been sourced from far away or sourced locally, but I do think that local materials suggest we're looking at at least a local workshop. Perhaps we have a Fatimid craftsman who has come, perhaps via George of Antioch, to Sicily, but the carving is so distinct that it's also incorporating these Ifriqian modes, these local metalworking traditions, that it doesn't look like it was just made by a Fatimid craftsman who's only familiar with the techniques that are used in Fatimid Egypt. So we are seeing some kind of mixture that's brought about through a movement of people, certainly, and local production. But we don't have any sources to document that. We have no description saying where the craftsman came from, where anything came from. So what we have is the materials, and to see what story the materials tell.
Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I have two questions. One, I mean, wood and doors makes a lot of sense. But wood is primarily used for building ships. And I wonder to what extent you're looking at something that is a margin of a bigger industry of shipbuilding, right? One can think of the relationship between building ships and the cigar store Indian, right? In later centuries, right? This type of carving, which leads to the second question, which is, we know from our friend the Geniza that a lot of things that moved, for instance, in the Indian Ocean were basically doors and cabins that were built from, let's say, South Indian wood that was carved and then taken apart and then installed in other places. So I wonder to what extent you're kind of implementing very 20th century connoisseurial methods on a relatively broad and waiting to be exploded field. And so you kind of like, by listening to you, it was kind of clear that that there's so much more that doesn't fall within the group that you have created, or it's not the group that you have created, the group that was created for you. And so to what extent you're thinking of expanding or breaking this group apart?
Certainly, you're absolutely right. There is so much more material, and that's where this project to map Fatimid wood networks came out of, having spent months and months down this rabbit hole of looking at this group of Norman Sicilian wood carvings. There is so much more out there, and in order to really understand it, we need to understand all of the other material. To your first question, thank you so much for bringing that up. Yes, it is absolutely a byproduct of shipbuilding. That is the primary industry, and when we look at the sources, that is the primary thing that is being spoken about. We have a handful of comments about decorative objects and imported materials for luxury furnishings, but the best evidence that imported woods were used for imported furnishings is simply the wood species analysis, that you see that it's coming from materials sourced in India or Africa. The documents there just isn't documentation to help discuss that. To break apart the corpus, again, I think that in order to do that, we need to look at all of these other materials. The African material is virtually unstudied. When it is studied, it's looked at in conversation with the materials in Al-Andalus, which is vital and a completely different direction. And at the same time, in addition to wood carving, you have to think about ivory, which so many scholars have noted these similarities in wood carving, in the craft with ivory carving as well. So it just explodes into this massive, massive corpus of material we'll look at.
Can you look at any shipwrecks?
Not yet, no. From the one or two studies that I've looked at, there are a handful of charcoal pieces, so wood charcoal, but I haven't moved beyond that yet, but it is a great suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. Super interesting. I was just at the Met this morning looking at some of these, and so it's great to see them. I wonder whether you've thought about the similarities in terms of just the networks of production that of textiles that might illuminate some of the certainly the type of decoration and the patterns, and how that might shed light on workshops and craftsmen and just these larger kind of mapping issues.
It's a great question. Thank you. What we know about textiles that have moved, especially between Sicily and Ifriqiya, it's a very similar scholarly problem. Most of the conversations have looked at Sicily and Egypt because material in Sicily has not survived. And so we're basically trying to reconstruct what was originally there. There have been a few tentative studies which have suggested, again, a continuity between pre-Norman and Norman textiles across Sicily and Ifriqiya. So it does seem to support the same idea, but we don't have textiles to look at. There are a handful of inventories from treasuries, which include descriptions. So that leads to a different direction, looking at Arabic terminology that's being used. So that's certainly one approach, but I think certainly looking at decorative motifs and textiles would also be helpful when looking at what survives. It's just a question of what survives, but it's definitely a great direction to look into. Thank you.
Could we do a thought experiment?
Yeah.
And let's fast forward to when the mapping project is done. What are some of the things that we could possibly learn that would change how we look at this particular subject or neighboring fields or prior or subsequent ones?
Great question. Thank you. I think one of the most essential outcomes is the ability to look diachronically across Egyptian production from the Pharaonic period up into the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, that would require a much bigger database than I'm capable of creating, but we can look at how is wood production changing, how is the raw materials changing, how is the movement of materials changing across regime change. And I think that's a very interesting way of understanding raw materials and decorative approaches, and how, if at all, regime change religion change, have an impact on artistic production.
Okay, that was great, because it sounded like, as you were articulating it, that the commodity was at the center. And these other aspects were ways of looking at the commodity through different lenses. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, the commodity is at the center, certainly, but as the project grows, I think it's essential to look at all of these other historical and political changes, as well as the economic changes, certainly.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much. And since you'll be around, we look forward to hearing more from you informally and be able to ask questions at a later date. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.